Hi, this is Dr. Lat Mansour, Research Lead of Health, H.V.M.N and Nutrition here on H.V.M.N podcast. This episode, I interviewed Chris Irvin, who is a nutrition researcher, writer, and educator of low-carb dieting for metabolic health. He's also the Chief Marketing Officer of a company called BioCoach. In this episode, we talked about difference between exogenous ketones and ketogenic diet with regards to performance and exercise. We also talk about the importance of ketones in metabolic health and solving neurodegenerative diseases. So if you are interested, stay tuned and enjoy this episode. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for coming on to H.V.M.N podcast. I know today is a quite early recording for both of us, but thank you very much. We made it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Lad. I think, taking a little shot of ketones before this episode is going to help me wipe that sleep from my eyes so we can have a good episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So did I. So I did take it about 15 minutes before. So I think it's about time kicking in now.
Should be kicking in.
All right, cool. So this episode of H.V.M.N podcast, I would love to pick your brain around your field of study, your current passion, your current interest. And let's start with telling our listeners and our audience who you are, what your passion is, and what's your background.
Yeah, so my name's Chris Irvin, and most people know me on social media as the ketologist. Still sticking with that despite the fact that everybody thinks keto's dead and is no good. I'm still riding that out and posting a lot of keto content. My background is, I went to my undergrad. I studied primarily exercise science. I was a two-sport athlete in college, played basketball and baseball. So, was really into studying human performance and, just really for just like personal use, like what can I do to kind of optimize my human performance. And kind of along that journey, I got like a little bit of an introduction to nutrition, but didn't really, I had some early interest in it in undergrad, but it didn't really strike me too, like it didn't really kind of set me off on a tangent to dive into nutrition. I looked at it a little bit from like a performance aspect, like what can I do before, basketball games to improve my performance. But besides that, didn't really look at nutrition from like the health lens. And then after I graduated, I was kind of on my career path was to get into strength and conditioning. I was training high school and collegiate athletes, was looking to get into strength and conditioning at the professional level, wanted to be a strength and conditioning coach in the NBA. Kind of had that as like my peak thing. That would have been top of the line goal for me to hit. And during that journey, I kind of got introduced into bodybuilding. Actually, I had a coworker who was doing bodybuilding, and kind of thought that was interesting. Got into it a little bit, and because of that, got a little bit heavier into nutrition. As anybody knows that does any sort of like physique or bodybuilding type stuff, like nutrition is huge. You can't get down to 4 or 5% body fat just by doing crunches in the gym. You really have to dial in your nutrition. So that got me really interested in nutrition. I realized how little I knew about it, and had a desire to go back to school. So I went back after a year off. Went back to school to a master's program down here in Tampa, University of Tampa. It was an exercise science and nutrition program, and was introduced to the keto diet. Actually, my first day of my first class, we was in a sports nutrition class, and we talked about the ketogenic diet for endurance performance. And I didn't, I'd heard a little bit about the diet, but didn't really know much about it. Started looking at a lot of the evidence that was out there and got super interested in it. Even though I wasn't really, an endurance athlete and didn't really have a lot of interest in that area, it was interesting to see this like, endurance sports, I've always been told is you need a lot of carbohydrates. It's kind of like a must. You have to, replenish that glycogen. And then we start looking at these studies that were coming out at the time from, Dr. Volek and, Tim Noakes was putting out a lot of good stuff in that area. And it's like, holy cow, like I've been wrong about this. So I went home that day and started the keto diet. Actually, that first day after class, I went to the grocery store, bought the traditional what used to be keto, all the bacon, cream cheese, ranch dressing, all of that stuff, and jumped into it. And even though I was making a lot of mistakes with the diet, like really started noticing that I was feeling incredible from it, and that just kind of made me start to wonder a little bit, like, wow, maybe there's something to this. Like I'm starting to feel, at the time I had this crazy schedule where I was working in the lab at our university from like I would go and I would personal train because that was how I made money in college. I would go personal train from like 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then I would go into the lab from like 8:30 a.m. to like 5 p.m. And then I would come back and train from like 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. And that was like 6 days a week I was doing that. And before I was doing that for a while before I was on keto, and my energy was just zapped. I was like hungry all the time and like, moody and just like, waking up tired. And, after a couple weeks on keto, I was like, damn, I feel like really good. Like this is crazy. So, I naturally started looking a little bit more into it and was just like blown away by how much research was actually out, and this is back in like 2015 where there's a lot more now, but even then it was like, wow, there's like a decent amount of studies out here. And at the time it was still mostly around like performance. The lab I was working in was an exercise science lab. So we were doing research on keto in like basketball players, and I think we had some like soccer players and lacrosse and baseball and stuff like that, and was finding a lot of cool stuff in that area because there wasn't a lot of research on that, like keto for sports performance outside of endurance. There wasn't a lot of research. So, I naturally, kind of just really got into that part, that like specific niche of the ketogenic research. And then, I think midway through my graduate studies, I came across the book Tripping Over the Truth by Travis Christofferson, who is a really great friend of mine now, and one of my favorite authors. And I read the book. It was one of those things, like picked it up, couldn't put it down, like read it in like 2 days, and kind of saw there was like an introduction into the therapeutic side of keto. And I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't even know about that. I didn't know that there could be some therapeutic utilization to this diet. I kind of was just looking at it as like a, weight loss and some sports performance applications. And so I kind of started diving into that a little bit, and it was amazing. I was blown away that so I was stumbled across like Dr. Angela Poff's research. She was looking at like exogenous ketones and the ketogenic diet in different models of cancer. And so I remember I read her full dissertation in the lab one day, and then found out like the next day that she was a guest professor. I didn't even realize that she was at USF in like, right down the street from us, and found out she was actually a guest professor that semester in our program. And I had chosen, it was a special topics class. So I had actually chosen already a biomechanics class because I was still a little bit more into that side, and I didn't choose her metabolism class. And I was so mad at myself. I was like too late to switch. I was like, oh my God, this girl who has this like amazing research that I'm reading is like literally in the building teaching, and I'm not in her class. So I like reached out and was like, I want to like get in the lab, like over there. Can I intern? Like, can I help in any way? And she was like really, really nice and took me in. And I went over there and was without a doubt the dumbest person in that building. And I don't say that to like just be like mean to myself. Like those people are over there were so incredibly smart, and I got to learn so much from them about the therapeutic application of keto. And this was really during a time when like it was less talked about. Like not many people were talking about keto for diabetes or keto for neurodegenerative diseases, or maybe even like the cardiovascular implications of it. And getting to be around all those incredibly smart people, I got to have like a little bit of an intro into that and see, that there was a lot more to this diet than just the weight loss and sports performance side. And during that time, this is kind of where my passion, I think, comes from, is I started to get really upset that I was like, I see these researchers who are just working their asses off every single day in this lab. And their research is being tucked away in these journals that people either don't have access to, or if they do have access to it, it's like hard for them to understand.
Yeah.
Just because reading research, as you know, is not an easy thing. It takes some training to do it.
Yeah.
So I started realizing that, one, I was nowhere near smart enough to be a PhD or to be a, somebody that was going to work in the lab setting. I kind of saw it's kind of like, as like an athlete, when you realize one day it's like, oh, there's the elite and then there's me, and that was kind of my realization that, I wasn't quite as elite as them. But what I found is that, maybe where I could make my impact would be through taking that information. I was good at reading research. That was kind of the thing that I had a passion for it. So I was like, maybe what I can do is be the person that can take this information and distill it down in a way that it could be applicable. So that's kind of where the Ketologist brand came from, as I, started, making infographics, breaking down research. And at the time in 2015, 2016, there wasn't a lot of people doing that. Like, I think maybe like Ruled.me was out at the time. I don't even know if Diet Doctor was out yet. Like maybe it was, but it was like still in its infancy. Actually, it probably was available, but it wasn't maybe as like mainstream. So, I got some pretty good early growth just from being like one of the only people that was doing that. And then, once I started doing that, like a lot of that was just driven on wanting to kind of like highlight and make the information that these researchers were working so hard on, just making it available to people so that it could impact more people. And then so that was kind of the early passion. But then once I started seeing the impact that was having on people, and so you start hearing these stories of people losing all this weight and getting off their diabetes medications and reversing cardiovascular disease risk and stuff, and then from there it just spirals out of control, and it's just like, this is amazing. Like I want to do whatever I can to kind of help progress this field forward and raise awareness around this diet. I think that can be really helpful. And that kind of led down a couple different career paths that we can get into later in this episode. But a lot of that's really where the passion stemmed from, is just realizing that what I had learned about nutrition was wrong, as many of us find out, I think, once we really dive into it, is that we've been told the wrong thing. And the wrong thing, not only is it just misinformation that we have, but it's like harmful to people, because there's a lot of lifestyle solutions, dietary solutions that are available for people who are dealing with chronic disease,
right?
And they don't know about it, and they don't really have access to it, and they're sick when they don't necessarily have to be. So I think a lot of my passion stemmed from just like not thinking that was okay, and realizing that like this is a broken industry and we have to do something about it. And that's how we got to where we are today.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive answer. I really love your backstory. But by the way, first of all, you are a very smart individual, and I've got a PhD, and never say that you're not smart enough to do a PhD. Like, if anything I learned from doing a PhD from the University of Oxford is that, because honestly, I did think that before I started, even after I got accepted, I didn't think I was smart enough to do a PhD. And going through it and doing all these experiments in the lab, I think having some form of common sense, some form of logical, rational sort of thinking, critical thinking, is important to do a PhD. But most importantly, what the whole PhD training really taught me was persistence and perseverance. Because you are doing something that is so narrowed down, so niched and so novel that no one else, you're not supposed to do something that someone else is doing, right? You're supposed to do something completely new as a PhD. So you don't know what the outcome is. And that's what science is. And that's what's fun about this. But at the same time, it also doesn't just turn around overnight. People don't understand, let these scientists figure out something, A, B, C, cause X, Y, Z. At the end of the day, you still need to go into the lab, spend time, refine the experiments, problem solve, and really figure out, is your experiment working, first of all? Is it answering your research question, second? And then third, can you then take this to the next level, to the next step? So the perseverance, the persistence, it's most important for me to complete my PhD. And I can totally see you doing it. Knowing you for a while now, Chris, no doubt. I have no doubt you can complete a PhD, but maybe do it in in the UK where it lasts 3 years. Because you can get it in 3 years. And instead of in the US where you are put through master's classes, within the first 2 years, and then you go into the lab. I think it's interesting though, the part. So I think part of it too was not just I think that I have some brains. I don't think that I'm a complete idiot, but I think what I realized is that I was never going to be able to be singularly focused on a single topic that would be required to do a PhD, right? It's reading research, I would find that for these 3 months, I'm reading every single cancer study and book that's out there. But then 3 months later, I'm just yeah, cool, I'm good. I want to read about diabetes. Let me switch over to diabetes, And I think that's what I remember I went to National Strength and Conditioning Association conference in New Orleans back in 2016. I remember sitting down and listening to a professor who was, I don't remember his name, but older gentleman, kind of towards the latter half of his career. And he was studying post-activation potentiation, so a very specific part of biomechanics and exercise performance. And I remember him going through, we're watching his presentation, he's presenting decades of research that he's covered on this single topic. And as he's talking, I'm kind of realizing man, I don't know that I could ever study just one single facet of a topic for that long. And then I remember him getting to the end of it and saying,
after all these decades of research, I've realized that I still don't know anything about this. And I remember that just being like a man, like I think for me it's just a little like it's I like to be, kind of a jack of a lot of trades. I guess I don't have a preference to be a master of none, but I think that just kind of comes with the territory of, when you want to be interested in a lot of different fields.
I was gonna say, like, when you read a topic for like 3 months, for example, and you really dive deep into it, you will realize then there's so much more to know, and the less you actually know. For example, like cancer, like I doubt you can actually go through everything in 3 months, because after that you're going to figure out that there are different types of cancers, there are different types of cells, there are different types of pathogenesis, and it's going to be more and more and more. So like what I did, I chose diabetes and cardiovascular disease as my specialization, but my research itself is looking at metabolism of type 2 diabetic heart in hypoxia specifically, and using hypoxia as a subset of ischemia, which is the lack of blood flow that causes myocardial infarction or heart attacks. And that is while that is very specific, I also needed to know everything to know about cardiovascular disease, about diabetes, about metabolism. So there's so much to learn in 3 years. But obviously, if I'm comparing myself to academia, to a professor, they do it for decades, right? They do it on another whole level, like a beast level. So that was why I left academia and come into industry, because I feel exactly the same way you do, where all these research, all these insights, all these learnings and knowledge are bottled up in a lab, or just written up in a published paper. It needs to go out to public. It needs to be applied, and absolutely can save lives. And the first company I worked for was a diabetes management program company based in Singapore. And they use an app to track food and track weight and activity and glucose. And that really, as you said, earlier, it really changes people's lives, because some people got off their medication, some people really reversed their diabetes. And that's when I see my knowledge and my work impacting others' lives. Yeah. So let's switch gear a little bit. And I know you talked a little bit about performance. Let's start there, and then we'll go into the metabolic health part of things. What do you think the role of ketogenic diet versus exogenous ketones in performance? And as you said, you went into quite deep in, outside of endurance athletes, endurance performance, using ketones or presence of ketones. Tell us more about what you found in exercises or workouts that are not endurance, and then the role of exogenous ketones versus keto diet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think the biggest thing that we found is that, this was a little more novel at the time versus now. I think more people understand this, but was that, we actually can perform a lot of really impressive physical feats without carbohydrates. Like, it really was this notion for the longest period of time that, like, you have to have carbohydrates to fuel. You have to carb load before exercise. You have to, replenish glycogen through carbohydrate consumption post exercise. And there really was no other way. There was no coaches really teaching anything different. And if you did teach anything different, you were a quack. And once we started, like the endurance component of it was really easy to understand, right? Like you could look at it and you could see, okay, what we see is that when you consume a lower carbohydrate diet and you become fat adapted, your body is able to transition into this much larger fuel source in fat that it can burn for energy, and then it can also produce ketones, which is an additional fuel source that can allow you to continue exercise. So, it kind of makes sense that it works. And then as the years went on, we saw, Volek published that monumental study in 2016 where he found that glycogen resynthesis rates, which was kind of this big driver of why people were consuming carbohydrates, were actually the same in people who weren't consuming carbohydrates, people who were kind of longer-term keto-adapted athletes. And that was kind of that was kind of like the nail in the coffin on, like, not that one is necessarily better than the other, but that, one is just as good of an option as the other, and, that you can kind of choose which way is best for you. But for a long time, there was kind of still this notion that like more like glycolytic things like, strength-based and power-based stuff we would see kind of like a big detriment through not consuming carbohydrates. And a lot of this was kind of centered around those age-old thoughts around, carb loading and stuff. But then also it was based on these very short duration studies, 3 to 5 day, maybe 7 day studies looking at athletes on the keto diet and then seeing decrements in strength and decrements in different power metrics. And what we know now, and especially for anybody who's done keto, is that it takes your body some time to keto adapt. If you've never done keto before, and let's say you go in and you do your 1 rep max for bench press, and then you start the keto diet, and 3 days later you go in and do it again. Anybody who's done keto knows you're going to be a little bit weaker at that point because your body has not adapted. So we were running a little bit longer duration studies in athletes, and we were doing it. We had some athletes, but we also had just a generally like one of the studies that I helped head up was just college students who weren't necessarily athletes, but they were all like well trained, people who were training like 3 to 4 days a week. And what we saw is that, once their body got adapted, that they were able to hit a lot of the same marks. Like they were able to kind of meet, the same strength metrics, the same power metrics. They weren't really seeing decrements as they started getting adapted to the diet. So that kind of like opened the door to like, oh, maybe there's some application and utility into these other things. And then, there was some really good like practical studies that came out around that time too. Rachel Gregory published a really cool study looking at kind of general population CrossFit athletes on like, I think it was like a 8-week or 12-week keto diet, and saw that they were able to maintain, a lot of their performance stuff. So it started to become really clear that for the average Joe, and I say average Joe as, anybody who's not getting paid to play professional sports or who's not doing like extreme sport things, that, if you tailor your diet the right way, your keto diet the right way, which I think involves, consuming more protein than probably what's the traditional recommendations, timing up your food well, supplementing with electrolytes, things like that you can perform just as well. And that I think is a big finding, because for the general population who's exercising, it's not, your goal isn't necessarily to be in the 1%. Like you don't need to go into your gym and be in the 1% in strength. Like you're trying to be healthy, right? Yeah. You're trying to feel good day in and day out. So, not consuming carbohydrates for those people, especially if they're metabolically damaged, is going to be a good way to help them get more out of their exercise. They're going to be able to still make a lot of improvements. You can also gain muscle, without carbs, contrary to what people had thought at that time. So I think that was a big thing. And then as I started working, and this is where kind of the exogenous ketones came in, is that when I started working with professional athletes and like professional football players and baseball players and stuff, I started realizing that, for them, performance is their number one goal. Being 1% better for them is a big deal. That's the difference between, winning their competition, getting, that salary that kind of sets them up for the rest of their lives. Like it really is a big deal for them. And for them, carbohydrates can provide an ergogenic aid. They can provide a boost in sports performance, especially if you are metabolically healthy and your body is carb tolerant and insulin sensitive. Then these things are really good for you to consume. And that's when I think exogenous ketones started getting really interesting, because exogenous ketones in general have unique benefits related to performance. Outside of just being a fuel source, they have the ability to, reduce inflammation produced from metabolism. They can increase natural antioxidant production. There's even some interesting research around them being able to stimulate protein synthesis, which, I think is another interesting thing around them. So there's a lot of utility to them. But for the wide receiver in the NFL who's 6% body fat, and is extremely metabolically healthy, and can, take carbohydrates and perform really well, it doesn't make sense for them to just go full keto, 30 grams of carbohydrates, ketogenic diet. They may see that kind of 1 or 2% dip in performance that can, potentially harm them. So, and affect their performance. So where exogenous ketones come in is that you can kind of get the best of both worlds. You can have elevated ketones. You can get those benefits from the ketones, while also, they kind of call this the dual fuel approach, while also getting the benefits from the energy that you get from carbohydrates. And then, of course, and we can get into this, a little bit later, but like, of course, there's the, in football specifically in that example, the utility for traumatic brain injury and concussion, which I think is something that is not talked about enough, kind of the metabolic side of that. But even outside of that, there's just a lot of benefit to being able to have both of those things available. So exogenous ketones have created this ability for people to not have to choose between one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to choose between having glucose as your primary fuel source and having ketones circulating. You can do both. And just anecdotally, somebody who still plays, basketball at a, fairly high level and everything, is that I've seen an incredible boost in performance. Like, I feel better on the basketball court now at 30 years old than I did at 21 when I was, actually, a young college athlete and everything. So it is an interesting thing. And I hope it's kind of an area that will continue to grow with awareness around it, because, I'm a sports junkie. Like, I love human performance. I love looking at these like top athletes, the LeBron Jameses and, all these people like that. And it's like, I would just love to see these guys on ketones, right? Like, I would love to see, what could be the extra 1 to 2% for them if they were kind of maximizing the metabolic component of their human performance. So hopefully we get to that, one day where that becomes a little bit more mainstream. And I think we're heading in that direction. But as we know with anything, science and especially sports science is very dogmatic, and there's a lot of resistance to change from the status quo. So, there's always that famous saying that a lot of people have to die for change to happen, right? I don't know that it has to go that far, but a lot of people are going to have to put their egos aside and realize that maybe there's, other ways to optimize human performance for these athletes.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. And for our listeners as well, like, when you go on ketogenic diet, you are depleting your carb sources, you're depleting your glycogen, and therefore your body will start creating ketones from fats in your liver. So that's why in a physiological state, it's almost impossible to have high glucose in your body and high ketones, because when you have high glucose, you're spiking up your insulin levels, and that insulin level is what inhibits the ketogenesis or ketone production in your liver. And I'm going to ask you this question as well, Chris. I know a lot of our customers, our listeners also have asked this question, is if it is not a naturally physiological condition, am I tampering with the wrong thing? Am I playing with fire here if I'm having exogenous ketone? Well, I'm screw up my metabolism, or two, build up tolerance to it. What are your thoughts about it? I can share about what my thoughts are, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept, and admittedly, we do need a lot more research into like questions like that, right? Like, I think it's becoming well established that ketones are safe. It's well established that they can be effective for a number of different things. But some of those little like mechanistic things, I think we still could benefit from some more research around. But I think if you just look at the way that especially a product like H.V.M.N has that is more bio-identical to what your body produces versus some of the other things that are out on the market. The utilization by the body, and which you can just tell by the way that you feel when you take it, the utilization by the body is a lot superior versus, something else. So I think, that's one thing. But I think the big question that a lot of people tend to have with this is like, if I take exogenous ketones, is it going to like stop my natural ketone production? Because one of the big mistakes that was made early on with exogenous ketones is that, they were marketed as like a weight loss thing. Because for some reason people would associate having elevated ketones with weight loss. But as you kind of highlighted, like the ketones that are produced naturally, those occur from low insulin levels, stimulating the body to release fatty acids and the body to burn those fatty acids, and some of those fatty acids being burned in the liver and converted to ketones. So in that sense, ketones can be a marker of weight loss and fat loss, but in the sense of taking a drink, they're not going to directly. Now, I do think there's some interesting, supporting mechanisms, but they're not going to directly cause weight loss. So, I think people, they get a little bit worried about that. Like, okay, if I'm going for keto for weight loss, for instance, and I take this, is it going to prevent my body from, producing ketones naturally and burning fat? And the answer, I think, can be, again, we don't know this for certain. There hasn't been a great study that's like looked at this, and really to design a study like this would be hard. But I think you can just see through yourself, and you can actually, test this yourself. If you get a ketone meter, you can just, measure your baseline ketones. Let's say that I'll give an example. I did it recently. My baseline ketones, I woke up fasted, sitting around like 0.5 millimolars. I take the H.V.M.N. Somewhere around, between like 15 minutes and an hour is when I typically start to see the peak. I see the rise and I start to see the peak in there. It gets up to anywhere between like 1.5 and 2 millimolars. And then, 2 hours, and then it starts, 2 hour mark, 3 hour mark, it starts tapering back down. And then I go back down to 0.5 at the end, and I kind of maintain 0.5. And then if I were to continue fasting, maybe it would start creeping up again from the fast. But what doesn't happen is that my ketones never go back to zero. So, and I think that's kind of one of the indications of like, if it was blunting my natural ketone production, if it was making my body resistant to burning fat and producing ketones, then I would expect that number after I've burnt through those exogenous ketones to be at zero. Which I've never seen, both in the lab setting when I was studying exogenous ketones in the subjects that we would have, or in myself. So I don't think that there's, anything to fear about it. And being somebody, I've had exogenous ketones in my system for a long time. Like back in 2015, we were, raw powders in the laboratory, like testing all these different things. And I've had them in, so I don't know that there's probably not a lot of people that have had more exogenous ketones in their body than me. And I haven't developed any sort of intolerance to them over the last 6 years of doing that. So, of course that's an antidote, but haven't heard, that from anybody else either. So I think that they're, when you look at them that way, you realize that like they can't be looked at as a replace. I think the only situation where ketones could be, exogenous ketones could be looked at as a replacement to the diet would be in that professional athlete, elite, they're not looking for any other benefits other than just really performance, then they could be a replacement to it. But for everybody else who's looking for the the other benefits that come with keto, like the overall improvement in metabolic health and stuff, they're not going to ever be a replacement for that, but they're really good support for that, and they're a really good way for you to get more out of that and to kind of maximize. And especially, like, I always like to just drop this line in there too, that I think the best utilization of an exogenous ketone is in conjunction with a keto diet for the general population, because you are, when on keto, you become really efficient at utilizing ketones, and your body's kind of primed to do so. So getting that bump up that you get from the exogenous ketones, your body's in a great state to be able to use those, versus somebody who's maybe following the standard American diet, is incredibly insulin resistant, hasn't really ever been in a state of natural ketosis, so they don't have this upregulation of these transporters that are really important to help get ketones into the cells, might not be as beneficial as somebody, and I'm not saying no benefit, but not beneficial as somebody who is primed to take those ketones in and use them. And I think that's why we see, people in this space. I remember, introducing H.V.M.N. to a couple like keto dieters, and them just being like, I took this 20 minutes ago and I just hit a PR in the gym. Or like, I took this like before a presentation for the first time, and my brain was just like firing on all cylinders. And it's like, yeah, because your body is like ready to soak up those ketones and use them. So I haven't seen anything yet that has made me be concerned about, blunting any sort of natural production or making us intolerant to them. But I'm curious if you've seen anything different on your side with the research.
No, I haven't seen either. And the way I explain it as well is not to compare ketones to drugs, to stimulants, because our bodies naturally and evolutionarily have been designed to be able to, one, produce ketones, and two, metabolize ketones. So we already have all the enzymes sitting there. We already have all the DNA codes that can produce those enzymes that transport ketones into the cell, metabolize them and all that, right? So you providing the substrate in and of itself will not create something that is not natural, right? So unlike a stimulant where you need something to stimulate, brain activity, for example, like coffee, for example, like over time, that stimulation builds up tolerance. And that's the difference here, because ketone is a natural substrate. It's how we're not resistant to proteins. We are not resistant to fat, right? They are just substrates that provide energy, but on top of that, also having signaling properties that help with everyday, sort of tasks and inflammation and all of that. Yeah. So I think people need to switch their thinking around exogenous ketone, that it is not a drug, but it is I think the first sort of 2 episodes ago, when I interviewed Dr. Dom D'Agostino and Dr. Angela Poff, and she worded it very nicely. Ketone is a substrate or um, a molecule, a food molecule that has drug-like properties
Yeah.
because of the effect that it has on your brain, on your metabolism, on signaling. So in and of itself, it shouldn't build any tolerance. And as you said, like it does not really blunt your production of ketones in the long run, because when you have
Mm-mm.
exogenous ketones, what they have seen in studies is that they do upregulate these enzymes, transporters that bring ketones into the cell, as well as the enzymes that metabolize ketones for energy. So if you think about
Mm-hmm.
it, you are basically priming your body to be able to metabolize these ketones. So when your exogenous ketones has gone off, as you've metabolized them, you are switching it back to your endogenous ketones that you produce
Mm-hmm.
yourself, and you're now more efficient because all these enzymes are already fired up as well because they're
Yeah.
upregulated during your exogenous ketone consumption.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting, possible utilities of exogenous ketones. And really, when I first started researching exogenous ketones, this was kind of the first use case that I had kind of stumbled across that I thought would be great, is really to help with that keto adaptation period because of what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
We do have research that shows, and I'm not sure. It's been a little bit since I've looked at this part of the research. So at the time, it was more cell culture stuff, but we do see that when these cells are exposed to even exogenous ketones, there is an upregulation of these MCT transporters that are required for these to be taken into the cells and used for energy. And what we know is that it can take a little bit for that to happen. Like if you're somebody who is really insulin resistant, and you've been following the standard American diet for a really long period of time, you haven't really ever been on a low carb diet, it can take your body a while to get to the point where it's producing a sufficient amount of ketones to be able to upregulate those transporters naturally. That's why we kind of see a lag in people between I started seeing like zero 0.3 millimolars on my ketone meter, but I still feel like crap. Like, what's going on? And it's like, well, you haven't really reached that threshold where you're starting to upregulate those transporters to use those efficiently. So I think that's a really good utility, is taking those things early on can kind of get you that higher level than what you would be able to achieve at that time naturally, that I think can upregulate those transporters a little bit more quickly and help you get through that. And just as kind of like an acute benefit, the exogenous ketones provide a lot of things like energy and mood boosting and cognitive function improvements that are just naturally going to make the diet easier. I mean, so many people start keto and they fall off because they feel like crap initially, right? And sometimes that's because of electrolytes, but a lot of times it's also because their body is not keto adapted yet. It's not really used to utilizing these ketones. So if you feel like crap all the time, you are more likely to hunger is another one. You're more likely to be hungry and binge eat carbohydrates and then think that keto is not for you. Or you're more likely to be like, oh, I tried keto. You hear it all the time. I tried keto and it just wasn't for me. And you're like, well, how long did you try it for? And it's like 7 days and I felt like shit. And you're like, oh, okay, well, you haven't, you didn't get to the part where it's great. You didn't get to that part where you're keto adapted. So I think that acutely they can kind of help you just during that time feel better, but then also I think that they can help you get adapted more quickly. And that's something I would love to see a study at, is just looking at, different markers of keto adaptation and seeing the difference between somebody just starting the keto diet, under 30 grams of carbs as is, versus somebody, doing that plus exogenous ketones. And just from what I've seen anecdotally and myself and other people, that period is a lot smoother. It's a much easier transition when you have the aid of exogenous ketones.
Yeah, I think a study like that would be very informative, and it also should
Mm-hmm.
be quite straightforward study as well. We can measure, the transporters themselves. We can,
Mm-hmm.
do some biopsies and looking at upregulation of different proteins that are related to ketone metabolism, and then we can measure subjective feeling of how that person is during that transition. And remember, guys,
Mm-hmm.
like every time you introduce a new diet, you introduce something new, that you introduce a change in general, you are introducing stress to your body. You need to let your
Mm-hmm.
body adapt to it. You need to let your body really get used to the new change. And usually that's when the adaptation period takes place, and you may feel not great, but give it time, and then you will feel the benefit. So I'm going to
Yeah.
switch gear a little bit here from
Mm-hmm.
on performance to metabolic health.
Yeah.
Since I know you're part of BioCoach, and would love to talk a bit on the role of BioCoach, what BioCoach does. And the
Mm-hmm.
question for you, Chris, is low carb or keto diet the answer to this ever growing chronic disease prevalence in America,
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of developed countries, and all around the world, really? So is this the answer, or is there something else that we should be looking at?
Yeah, so I think that it's a answer, right? It's one potential answer, and by way of the reason why I'm the ketologist is because I believe that it's one of the best ways that's out there. I think that if we look at the reason why we have poor metabolic health really does stem from nutrition. Now, of course, there's other things, lifestyle factors, environmental factors, sedentary lifestyle, all these things that can contribute to it. But really, if we're like 80-20 ruling it, nutrition is the big driver. And I think there's kind of two big parts of nutrition I think that are driving this metabolic health epidemic that we have, and I think it's the overconsumption of processed carbohydrates and then the overconsumption of seed oils. So we'll talk about kind of the carbohydrate component of that first. But if we look at, and generally too, just the overconsumption of food, right? Just consuming too many calories. So, the combination of these things make us insulin resistant. Like when I kind of use the terms insulin resistant and poor metabolic health interchangeably, because if you are insulin resistant, you have poor metabolic health. If you have poor metabolic health, you're insulin resistant. And I think when we look at it like that, as like, if that's the big issue, well, what are the ways that we can improve metabolic health and improve insulin resistance? And there are several ways you can do it. You can do it by eating lower calorie diet, right? You can do it by cutting out carbohydrates. You could do it by, intermittent fasting, which is going to also, you're going to reduce calorie consumption naturally because of that. And you're going to probably reduce total carbohydrate consumption. So there's a lot of different tools that you can use to get to this goal of kind of pulling back on calories a little bit, lowering your carbohydrate intake so that you can allow yourself to become more insulin sensitive. You can reverse that insulin resistance and you can improve your metabolic health. And while there are a lot of tools out there, like the reason why I think keto tends to be the best one is because of the other things that come along with it. So, it's very well established that on a ketogenic diet, through reducing your carbohydrate consumption, you're going to improve your really key metabolic health markers. You're going to improve fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin, A1C, a lot of cardiovascular markers, inflammation, all of these things that you're going to improve. So we kind of know that. But then in addition to that, there's the components of the diet that make it a little bit easier to stick with this change long term. So we know that when you follow a low-carb ketogenic diet, you see improvements in hunger hormones typically. If you look at a low-calorie diet, for instance, we see the opposite, where hunger hormones spike when we're on a low-calorie diet, and it makes it hard for us to maintain that diet and not want to binge eat and things like that. So, I always like to make that kind of distinction because there's not just what happens in a laboratory setting in a controlled condition. Like what matters is what happens out there in the real world. And if I'm trying to diet and improve my metabolic health, and I'm walking around every day tracking my calories and saying, I'm going to eat 1,500 calories today. And then, every time I walk by a bagel shop, I want to go in, or I walk by a bakery, I want sweets really bad. And then one day I just break and I binge eat. And then I decide I'm not going to diet for, another 3 months because of that. Like that isn't going to work. Like, even though it would have worked if I would have stuck with it, like it's not practically very effective for a lot of people. And what a lot of people will find a lot easier than that is to say, I'm just not going to eat this food group in carbohydrates. And that's going to make a big difference for improving these metabolic health markers. And actually, I feel a lot better when I do that. Instead of feeling tired and groggy like most people do when they diet, I actually feel energetic. I feel like I have a better mood. My brain's functioning really well. I don't have hunger. I have this stable blood sugar, which is kind of the reason why you're experiencing all those things that I just said. So that is why I think it is such a great option, is that it's just an easier way to do it. Like I hear time and time again, people being, it's funny because we have this argument with like the calories in, calories out folks, where it's like, people will be like, oh, well, the only reason why keto works is because you're in a calorie deficit. And while I don't think that's true, there's a lot of additional benefits to it. A lot of what you get out of keto is because of a calorie deficit. But the point is that it's easier to maintain that calorie deficit on a keto diet than it is on other diets because of those factors that I just mentioned. So that's why I think it's easier. Like for a lot of people, you're going to find that it's a lot easier to just like not eat the candy bar than it is to eat half of the candy bar, right? And it's a lot easier to like, consume meat and vegetables rather than, going to McDonald's and getting like a Happy Meal and then, to keep your calories low and then, trying to make it to like 3 hours before you like have another snack and stuff like that. That's hard. Whereas like for a lot of people find keto is like, it's kind of, it's just a lot easier way to do it. You don't have to maybe track your calories. You can kind of naturally fall into that calorie deficit. So I think that's the reason why I get excited about it. I think that it's a much more sustainable approach. Now, of course, there's, the mainstream kind of growth of ketogenic diets and low carb dieting has introduced new obstacles to this. Now we do have food products that are, hyper sweet, hyper palatable that can kind of make it a little bit more difficult for us to maintain the kind of even keel hunger and stuff like that. Or, you have these products that really, they say they're keto, but they're really not. You test your blood sugar and they spike your blood sugar like 100 points. And people who aren't testing their blood sugar wouldn't know that that's going on. So they can't figure out why they're not seeing, the benefits that everybody talks about with keto. So there are new obstacles that have been introduced as the kind of industry has gotten involved in this. But I think as a whole, if ketogenic dieting is done the right way, it's the fastest, easiest, and in my opinion, most sustainable way to improve your metabolic health. So I think that for most people, it is going to be the answer to this metabolic health epidemic.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a great explanation. You covered very nicely. And even if people say even if it is the calorie deficit that comes from ketogenic diet, some people actually can use some of the calorie deficit because of the excess calories that we've been consuming these days, because of the hyper palatable food that we're having that has that are calorie dense. Maybe we could use some calorie deficit in our lives, and that could eventually improve your insulin sensitivity, and also ultimately just having that relationship with food, having that clearer, like healthier relationship with food, also puts our mind in a better place in order to work out, for example, in order to live that healthier lifestyle. And that all ties together in really combating this chronic disease prevalence, because it's not just just food, it's not just exercise, it's not just mental health, it's all of them combined together. And if you can sort of, I wouldn't say control, but if you can improve one aspect of it, you can certainly contribute to the progress of the other aspect of things.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really big thing, and we see that all the time. Like, if you're like metabolically damaged and, which like, if you look at the wide variety of health impairments that come from insulin resistance, I mean, it's everything from, type 2 diabetes all the way to you just like having a bad mood and low energy, right? Like, it's such a broad spectrum of issues that you have. And you start seeing that, like, if you're insulin resistant and you're metabolically damaged, like, and you feel that way, not only is just your health going to be poor, but like how, and you're going to be, you're going to be craving poor foods. You're going to be, hungry all the time. You're going to be more likely to mess up the nutrition component, but also like, how are you going to get to the gym if you don't feel great? How are you going to maintain that schedule? If waking up at, for some people, waking up at 5 a.m. is what's required for you to get in the gym. That's the only time that's available. Well, how are you going to wake up at that time if you feel like crap? How are you going to perform well at work if your brain isn't functioning optimally? So I think that is what we see, is that when people follow this, they get the weight loss happens very quickly on keto. You can see improvements in some of those metabolic markers like A1C, blood sugar, and insulin very, very quickly on it. And then once those changes start happening, then people start realizing like, oh, I can actually go to the gym now. And actually, because I lost 20 pounds, my knees don't hurt anymore when I'm at the gym like they used to. So I actually enjoy being here. And like, I woke up today full of energy, not feeling like I needed to guzzle a pot of coffee to get out of bed. Like, and I'm actually excited to go into this work presentation because like I prepared really well for it. And I'm like pumped to like talk to like my coworker. It's like all of these kind of downstream trickle effects that happen that just generally lead to a better overall quality of life. And we actually at BioCoach, we published an article recently looking at quality of life metrics from low-carb dieters or low-carb dieting and diabetics. And there really is, you see a drastic difference in those things because, rather than like walking around feeling sad that I can only eat this many calories and And which, by the way, taking the calorie approach doesn't usually give you all those other benefits, those downstream benefits that we're talking about. Instead people feel like, oh, I get to eat steak again. I didn't realize that steak and eggs was actually good for me. Like, holy cow. And like, oh, I can actually make these, this cauliflower taste pretty darn good. And so, like the nutrition component's good, but then you get these downstream effects like being in a better mood, having more energy, that, there's quality of life improvement just in those things. But then you think about what those things impact. Oh, now I don't feel guilty about the fact that I had no energy to play with my kids, right? So now I feel great, and I feel happy just because I was able to be like a good parent and like, give more to like my children, right? So then you get even another level of like downstream benefit that you're getting from these things that happen. So there is just a big quality of life improvement. And I think that's a big thing that's missing in these like calories in versus calories out, or, dietary debates, is like, I don't care what happens in the lab setting when we're looking at 5 different markers. I care what happens to the mom who, doesn't feel good and is, dealing with all these health issues and is going into their doctor and looking for answers and not getting them and put on all these medications. And then all of a sudden starts this diet and all of those things improve. Like that to me matters a lot more about, than a study that tells me that, keto versus this diet leads to the same amount of fat burning or something like that. It's like,
Right.
let's look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And what role does BioCoach play in all of this?
Yeah. So, what we're doing at BioCoach is so to give a little bit of a picture of like what we are. So we're we're both a hardware and software company. We have a medical device. I actually have it right here, our blood glucose and ketone meter. So we've talked about tracking ketones and glucose in this episode. So we have this, and then this tracks and reports all of the data into an app. So, and there's a lot of other companies that have similar products to this, an app that will track your trends over time and show your charts and show your responses to food. But what we're realizing through like just talking to customers and people in the space, like, me talking to people on my social media, is that people just need guidance. They need to know what to do. And then not only do they need to know what to do, they need support in getting that done. They need somebody to kind of walk with them along the way. And that's really what the purpose of BioCoach is, and what we're doing in our app is we're creating, these health journeys that you can join, where these health experts are walking you through what it means, like what intermittent fasting looks like, what ketogenic dieting is, how to interpret your numbers, how to know which foods are best for your metabolic health right now, as where you are today, what is the best kind of approach for you to reach your goals, and then kind of putting around these behavioral change components so that you can better stick to this. So, we have gamification and reward systems built into the app to kind of help people with those things. So the goal is to like, there's a subset of the population who will look at the research, they'll figure out what's best for them, and they'll run through a brick wall to do it. And admittedly,
Right.
like I'm kind of one of those people, like I look at food as function a lot of times. If you tell me that something's good for me, I don't care if it tastes bad, or, like I'll just do what's required for me to be healthy. And it's a little bit, to be honest, it's easier for me to maintain health because of that. But a larger percentage of the population, they're not really willing, like, like most people know that they're not supposed to have a donut for breakfast, right? Like nobody's thinking that that's a healthy thing to start your day with, right? Nobody's going to a gas station getting a, 52-ounce soda and thinking that's good for them. So, maybe there are people that are doing that. So we are trying to reach them too and show and tell them that is not good for them.
Right.
But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to show them, why it's not good for them. Like, hey, why don't you, drink that soda and test your blood sugar, and then let me show you what your results are. And then
Right.
here's what, that result, here's what that means for you. But then also telling them, like, I know you don't want to eat that donut, and we want to help you not want to eat that donut anymore either. So we want to show you options. We want to, we have, meal planning, as well as meal prep, like, at home, like meal delivery services that are built into our program as well, where it's like, if your biggest problem is that, you're at lunch at work and, they just keep having junk food in the break room, and you're going out on like all these, you're traveling and you're having a hard time, eating good food. Like, we want to provide these foods for you to help you actually reach that goal. So it's not just about telling people, I think the simple way that we like to talk about it is that a lot of these other apps out there will tell you what you've done, with, based on the data, but we're trying to tell you what to do. and how you can improve that. So we're trying to be a little bit more applicable, and so that's really the mission that we're on, and it's a mission that it's a big one. Like 89% of the population is metabolically damaged, and that means that almost all of the population is who we're trying to help. Which as somebody who's in the marketing department, that's not really how you typically go about product development and marketing. Is to say we're going to try to reach everybody, right? Like that's generally not a good idea. But that's what our goal is we're trying to help as many people as possible who are on both sides of it, whether it's the people who know and then they want to make the improvements, or it's the people who don't know and we want to help them realize that there's another way, and that being like, here's what comes with improving your metabolic health. So we're on the journey, and we have a lot of work to do. We're in the product development stage, and we have beta testers testing the app right now. We're gearing up for January 1st launch out to the public, and it really is exciting. It's like to see the product really come to life, and to see the feedback that we're getting from our users. It's just like, it's a motivator. You talk about passion earlier in this episode. It's like it's so easy for me to wait. Like I wake up every day and like my feet just can't hit the ground soon enough, because I want to get out the door and like get this done. Like and it's like your motivation and your why becomes so much greater when you realize that there's so many people that can be helped, and then you get that feedback from people that you're actually helping. So it's amazing. So we're trying to do a lot, and we're making tons of mistakes and breaking a lot of stuff along the way. But I think that we're making a lot of like headway, and I think that we're making progress towards something that I think is going to help a lot of people.
That's absolutely great. So guys, if you guys feel like you could benefit from this, follow them. Make sure you know when the product's coming out from BioCoach, and sign up, right? So one last pillar of questions that I want to cover before we end this podcast is neurodegenerative diseases, right? We talked a lot about metabolism, metabolic health. Do you think that neurodegenerative diseases is just a progression where it's because our lifespan has extended over the past few centuries or so, or is there something to do with metabolic health?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to phrase that question, and I think it is a little bit of both, and because definitely as we age, like aging in general is going to lead to deterioration, right? But the way that we live our lives and the kind of the poor metabolic health that is kind of characterized by most humans now is what determines the rate in which we age. So we're progressing that aging process more quickly, and we're poor metabolism is making us age in maybe unnatural ways, or just not, or inefficient ways, I guess I could say. So I think that it's a little bit of both. But what we're seeing with neurodegenerative diseases, irrespective of age, is that there's this metabolic component that is there. And it's really one of the defining hallmarks. And a lot of people have thought that genetics is the big thing, or the big kind of thing recently was the amyloid plaques, and we realized that the research on that was a little bit fudged, not really what we thought it was, and that was kind of what was defining a lot of the new research that was coming out, and is what was kind of determining the direction in treatment protocols and pharmaceutical development and all these things. And we realized that those things aren't as consistent as we thought they were. But one thing that is definitely consistent in these neurodegenerative conditions is poor metabolic health. We see the brain having neuroinflammation. It's insulin resistant. It's inefficiently using glucose. There's an energy deficit. All of these things, and that's regardless of you can see that in somebody as young as 30 years old. Maybe they're not displaying very noticeable signs yet, but the metabolic component is there, and you can see it in people who are 90 years old. So I don't think that age is really the best factor there, and I think I'm kind of drawing I believe the study that Dr. Bickman points out is there's a study that kind of and it's epidemiology, but it talks about how like insulin resistance is actually a better predictor than even age is when it comes to your risk of neurodegenerative diseases. So, and when you look at the fact that like, yes, older people, you will tend to have a larger decline in cognitive health as you get older. But the question is that because you're getting older, or is it because that you're living longer with poor metabolic health? Exactly. Right? Like if people were dying at 50, and with poor metabolic health versus, now dying at 90 with poor metabolic health. Well, that's just 40 more years of having poor metabolic health. It's going to just be leading to continued deterioration of the brain. So there's so much work that needs to be done in this area. And I think that the recent findings with the amyloid plaque thing, I think is going to help drive more focus on this metabolic side of neurodegenerative diseases. So I hope that it will help accelerate the research and accelerate the treatment and even the pharmaceutical development, because I do think that there is a role for pharmaceuticals in this side of things if we know the right pathways and we kind of understand that metabolic side of it. So I hope that it will kind of accelerate it. But irrespective of the research that still needs to be done, what we know is that being insulin resistant and having poor metabolic health is going to be something that is a massive driver of neurodegenerative diseases. Which to me, I think is the best news that I've ever heard, right? Because when you think that it's a genetic issue and you think that there's nothing you can do about it, well, that sucks and that's scary and that's sad. But when there's something you can do about it, to me, that's the most enlightening, exciting thing. Like, oh, I could actually do something every day to reduce my risk or avoid this. Even if I do fall into that category of having a genetic predisposition for neurodegenerative diseases, I can actually choose, through my decisions, whether or not I'm going to let that progress and turn into something that's going to be harmful to me, or I'm going to suppress it with the decisions that I'm making on a day-to-day basis. So, not that that's an easy thing. That's not to oversimplify it and say that, maintaining a lifestyle that's conducive of optimal metabolic health is easy, but it is something that's within our locus of control, which to me is a lot more exciting than thinking we have to just flip the coin and see if our genetics are going to cause us to have Alzheimer's when we get older.
Right. Thanks for the answer, and I think that's definitely a very good way to look at it. How are we just extending our lifespan, or are we extending our lifespans while being metabolically unhealthy? I think that's where it is, and that's what increasing the prevalence and the risk of neurodegenerative diseases. One last question about you, really. You went from being an athlete to a scientist to now a chief marketing officer of a company. What drove your decision, and if you have any advice for people who would want to be a jack of all trades like yourself, like what would you give them?
Well, you just gotta have ADHD. That's the thing. You just gotta not be able to focus on one thing. No, it's an interesting question, because I would have never, I have I'm chief marketing officer at BioCoach, and I have no formal training in marketing. I did not go to school for it. Or anything like that. It really was kind of this natural progression. When I graduated from my graduate studies, I was working in a laboratory with Dr. Ryan Lowry, and he was starting ketogenic.com. And, I was just a scientist at the time. My job title was exercise scientist. And he kind of came to me and said, hey, I got this domain. I want to build an education site. He had a lot of other things he was focused on. So he was like, why don't you just kind of get this off the ground? And so I had to learn, social media marketing and graphic design and email marketing and, SEO and blog development and web dev and all these different things. And I started to realize that this, that goal I talked about early on of being able to help this research reach more people, having an understanding of that stuff and an understanding of the marketing is what's going to be able to make that possible, right? I can't just stand on the rooftops and shout it out and hope that I can reach a lot of people. In the age of technology, digital marketing is a way in which you can help people, help get that message out to more people. So I think I realized that during that time, and so then I decided to kind of do my own, master's, my own MBA in marketing by starting my own marketing company and running that for a couple of years, and that really helped me get to learn a lot about marketing as a whole. And then I took that and was able to join the Perfect Keto team and kind of work in their marketing department. And while I was, I was an education manager there, really focused on the science and education, but I got to learn from some of the best marketers in the world, these people that are just incredible. Definitely get to go to a marketing room and be the dumbest person in the room, which is great because it means I get to soak up all this knowledge. And through that, got to gain all of these skills that then I could come to a coach like BioCoach, come to a company like BioCoach that has this incredible mission, and then, be able to apply that that to the science background that I have and to their mission to try to help reach more people. So, I think that if I'm giving advice to anybody on it, I think it's just like not limiting yourself, not putting yourself in a box. Like it would have been a lot easier for me to say, well, I'm a scientist at this point, so I should go get my PhD and I should work in academics. And I think that would have been a limiting belief that I don't think I would have been happy with 10 years later, at this point in my life. But I think it's to just say and it's such a cheesy line, but the only thing that I've done consistently, I make the ADHD joke because I've done so many things and I changed so many things, but the only thing that's been consistent for me has been like following my passion and working hard. So while that passion is maybe changing at different frequencies, it's always it's always going along this line of trying to help people with nutrition and health. And that has just led me, into this area of marketing of being the tool to help people do that, and to help get that message out to more people. So no fancy, real video telling you like the 4 best tips to become like a chief marketing officer.
Maybe it's coming.
Or
Maybe that's the next step.
Yeah. Something. I don't know if I think that if you're looking for marketing advice, there's a lot better marketers out there than me. That I think would be better to give you advice, but I think what we're doing, over at BioCoach and what I get to do on a day-to-day basis is so fulfilling. And like I made that comment about waking up and feet hitting the floor. Like I really do wake up with just like this level of excitement that I know not everybody else is fortunate enough to get to experience in their lives, to wake up and feel fulfilled and be able to work a job that you're actually excited about. You go to work like I dread going to bed at night because I can't continue working because I want to keep focusing on this this project. So that's a luxury that I try not to take for granted. And I think that the more that you do that thing of following your passion and working hard at it, the more likely you are to put yourself in a position where you can live a lifestyle like that as well.
Yeah. Thank you for the advice. You always will be good at what you love to do, and then you always love what you're good at eventually.
Yeah.
So try to build that relationship and build that positive cycle and feedback loop, and ultimately before you realize it, you are doing so well at something you already love. Let's wrap this up with one last question. I know I said last question a couple of times. Yes. What is health and modern nutrition to you?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think, the modern part, I think, is what's really important about that. I think like nowadays we have like this, we're seeing this big like ancestral movement, which I think is great. I think the idea of like trying to live more like our ancestors lived is generally beneficial and probably going to get us closer to living how a human's supposed to live. So it's going to get us closer to optimal human health. We also have to realize that we live in our modern society. We live in a much different environment than what our ancestors lived in. So health is different now than it was back then. Like, our exogenous ketones weren't necessary for our ancestors 1,000 years ago, right? But they have a lot of utility now. Like, these little like biohacking things, like, like wearing blue light blockers didn't matter when blue light didn't exist, right? When we didn't have cell phones and things like that. So I think the modern component of that is huge. Is like we have to find how to, like, if you have the luxury of buying 100 acres of land and living in the country off the grid, and kind of removing yourself from society, like that's great. Some people have a desire for that and also have the resources to be able to do it. Like that's cool too. But there's also a lot of people that live in the heart of New York City, and that's where and they love it, and that's what they do, and that is a lot different than that, and that doesn't have to mean that you're unhealthy for living in those areas. So I think health in a modern world means figuring out what it takes to combat the things that we're both combat the things that we're faced with today that we weren't before, and to kind of integrate two things. Integrate kind of what is still beneficial from the ancestral way of living, and then take advantage of the new things that we have today that are so great. Like, our ancestors didn't have the ability to isolate, these compounds that can be super great for how they couldn't isolate lion's mane and, be able to take that and stuff. But that doesn't mean that it's not an awesome thing that we are able to do today. So I think that's the idea is just adapting to this new world that we live in and finding a way to live with optimal health, despite of that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. It has been a really great pleasure, as usual, Chris. I know I've been on your
Yeah.
podcast. We do IG Live every Friday morning, 10:30 a.m.
Yes.
PST. We talk a lot about metabolism, and we still manage to go over 1 hour on this podcast. So, yeah, guys, please join us on IG Live, and we do answer questions
Yeah.
live as well. Um, and Chris and I are also working on a book together soon. More details to come. So exciting
Yes.
to work with you, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for having me on, Lat. And yeah, really looking forward to doing our IG live tomorrow, and gonna have to bring you on for round 2, I think, on the Keto Answers podcast, because I got it's time for me to pick your brain again. So we'll have to do another episode over there.
I got to prep before that. And before you go, I want to really open the platform up for you to tell our listeners where can they find you, and what would you like to promote, and your website and all that.
Yeah, so I'm on all social media platforms as the ketologist. Instagram is kind of the primary one. I'm not on. I think I'm on TikTok, but I'm not doing anything on there. I think I'm just too old for that. But I'm primarily on Instagram. That's where I put out a lot of my educational content. I have a newsletter that is the Thinking Health newsletter that you can be found on Substack. So you can find that through the link in my bio. That's where I do a lot of. It's kind of a hybrid of nutrition with philosophy. So there's kind of this mindset component to nutrition. I have the Keto Answers podcast you can find on any platform that does podcasting. And then we talked about BioCoach today. So biocoach.io is our website, as well as our social media handle. We're also putting out a lot of really awesome content. We have a great content team over there putting out a ton of great information. We have a blog on our website. So, even if you don't decide to subscribe to the platform, we would love for you to take advantage of the educational resources that we're putting out there.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you very much for this episode, and I will speak to you soon.
All right. Sounds good, Lat. Thanks a lot.
If you have enjoyed the episode, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any comments or feedback, please leave it in the comment section. You can find us at H.V.M.N. on all social media platforms, and myself at Lat Mansour on all social media platforms as well. The H.V.M.N. podcast and myself are powered by Ketone-IQ, the most effective way for you to elevate your blood ketone levels for optimal cognitive and physical performance, as well as metabolic health. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.